But, I've worked alongside female photojournalists in 30 years, and we've done it as equals. I think, like recently in Bangladesh, I was photographing survivors, women survivors, and perhaps women may have a slightly easier access to that, but I still wasn't. I still made the effort to go there and hear their testimony as well. I did not do it because I was a man, if that makes sense. The same as I don't see any restrictions on the way women report, whether it's conflict or if it's their decision to be there, then they'll do it as an individual. I've never really seen it as a male-female thing, to be honest. I mean, when we sat down and, either stayed in the same hotel and shared stories, we've sat there as equals. I have no idea how relationships with picture editors are affected as to your genre or sex or race or ethnicity, I think it's difficult for everybody. But I've just seen that when we've been in these places together, they're shared experiences, and sex didn't really come into it.
Actually, it's funny because I agree also with David. When I was working for the United Nations in various countries like South Sudan or East Timor, there were many times where I was with the troops, which were a lot of men actually in the troops, but I was always considered as one of them, not like different because I was a woman. I also can relate to what David said in terms of the survivors of, for example, domestic violence. In a way, even though everybody can do it, in that case, for example, I thought women sometimes were a little bit more comfortable talking or sharing testimony with other women, but I don't think, that would come really into their minds. But sometimes it can be slightly an advantage to be a woman in that case, especially because in the UN you deal with lots of situations with victims of domestic violence or conflict, and so it's very, very sensitive sometimes, the subject. So being a woman can be an advantage, but in many cases in the field I found myself surrounded by a lot of men actually, and I was not treated differently because of that, so I felt really lucky in that sense to just be one of them in a way.
Look, I'm not sure how they measure how many photographers are out there. I guess they could do it. I guess World Press does a census of sorts, but there is an unequal number of practicing female photojournalists, I guess. I'm not sure how you measure such a thing, to be honest. They seem to be well represented in the field when I've been. Recently I was working alongside Patrick Brown and Thomas Manita and Paula Bronstein, and but there were quite a few female photographers, some of them whom I didn't know, but they were there. As to getting published, look, I know that some of the publications stick to whom they know best, whether that's a male-female thing. I know, you've got Stephanie Sinclair gets published on a regular basis, Andrea Bruce. I just know it's tough to get published no matter what sex you are. It's difficult to have working relationships or get people to even respond to emails these days. A lot harder now than it seemed to be 20 years ago. There's more opportunity to get self-published, so there's a way of getting your work seen even though you're not being paid to do so, and perhaps it's not by credible or recognised sources. It's yourself. Even Instagram, Facebook, I see a lot of photographers relying on that to get the work seen nowadays, which doesn't help earn income, but it does somehow get your work noticed. And I notice that even picture editors now rely on photographers having decent followings on Instagram to draw attention to them and then to be used by them. There are some organisations that have said that they prefer that the photographers they work with have a decent following before they'll work with them, which makes it complicated for everybody, not just males and females. I don't know why there are less female working photographers. I don't want to be flippant and say maybe because less want to do it. I have no idea how you'd measure it, to be honest.
Martine? Look, when I started photography in Sydney, I also had these casual shifts as a photographer for the Financial Review, and I was working at the desk at the time. And I remember I was actually pleasantly surprised, at least in that office. It was pretty much well balanced. There were quite a number of women photographers at the time, so it never really occurred to me, that there would be any gender imbalance in that case. And then when I started working for the UN, actually the chief that recruited me was a woman, and actually she really wanted to have a woman. Also at the time, there was that resolution, that Security Council Resolution 1325 that came into place in year 2000, where really they really were insisting about the involvement of women in participation of, talks on peace, peace building, peacekeeping processes. So I think once again, I was again in another environment where I could see the start of a push towards getting more women, actually. So I guess I haven't really noticed I've seen it in the fields for sure, that they're usually traditionally more men than women, but it's hard, like you said as well, it's really hard to understand exactly why, but often the situations in which we go to may not be, for example, always easy for some women, I guess, those conflict situations. I don't have, for example, a child, and we're a family, but I don't. So I guess women with family could be a little bit tougher as well.
Look, I think if women are being overlooked because they're women, then that needs to be addressed. There's no doubt about that, because from what I've seen from working alongside female photojournalists in the field, they're every bit as up to it as we are. There's no difference. So if they're being overlooked simply because they're women, then that's wrong and needs to be sorted. If it's because there are less women wanting to do it, then there's nothing I can do about that. It's not like coming out of university and being handed a degree in photojournalism. There's certainly no such thing in this country. It's just feet on the ground and have a go, and you don't publish your stuff.
Okay.
Which is pretty much the case for most of us anyway, male or female.
Yes, so I started, I was living in East Timor at the time. I was actually a freelance photographer at the time, and this is where I started meeting my UN colleagues, or to-be UN colleagues. And I applied actually to what we call the United Nations volunteer, which is slightly different than the one based in New York. That particular one is based in Bonn, Germany. And I thought I really pushed to be there just purely a photographer, because usually, traditionally, you would be what they call public information officer, but I didn't want to write. I knew what I wanted to do. So eventually I got a call one day for a gig in Burundi. So I actually took it, and I went there for a year. And I worked with that lady who was my boss at the time. And that was really, really interesting. And obviously, everything was brand new to me. I guess the way we worked, and that was actually in 2003. So what happened then, that's when I had that transition to digital photography. So everything was a bit chaotic, because I was in East Timor using film, and all of a sudden, a friend of mine, a journalist actually based in Sydney, brought me my first digital camera. So, but that was actually a blessing, because in a country like Burundi, it would have been complicated to work otherwise. So, so there was all of this huge transition, and working with military and working with police and working in a conflict country, in a dangerous country, where, we could potentially be held at gunpoint and all of this. So that it was a really complicated context, but at the same time, very, very fascinating. And I very much encourage women who would like to do that work to definitely go and look at, the various branches of the UN and see what they can potentially do, because there's a huge push to recruit actually women, very much so, in the UN system. And I just heard, I think, that now there's pretty much a parity with the top leaders working with Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the United Nations. So it's good to hear that they've pretty much managed that at the leadership level. But there's heaps of work to do, again, in the police, even in the civilian, but more so, I think, in the police and in the military. But at the same time, it's complicated. Not every woman wants to necessarily work in those areas, I guess. So it was not unusual for me, by the way, to be sent in the field and be surrounded by maybe 200 military male, and I would be the only woman in that. So that feels a little bit strange in one sense, but I had many brothers in another sense. So yeah, no, it's a really incredible experience, and despite all the sometimes frustrations of the bureaucratic, because it's a heavy machine, the UN really, I think if you're smart enough to forge yourself also, a role, your own role and your own voice, and your work gets published through the UN channel back in New York usually, and you can definitely, I think, make an impact for sure. I know that my photos are still used today, which is incredible, even 15 years later.
Yes.
Well, I guess when you work for the UN anyway, they're going to use it for all sorts of ways, in their institutions, but they will, if we can have them published, we will do it. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes there's certain sensitivity about certain jobs that never saw the light. So because of the sensitive nature of those jobs, but usually the images would be fed back to New York, and New York would then dispatch it, or you could also locally sometimes dispatch it to the media. So there were various ways to actually be published at the time.
And David,
most of my work's self-funded. It's always a gamble, but it's also a way of life. I wanted to do something I thought that could make a difference, was important, and that was a story I've been following for some time. I just never had the financial opportunity to go and cover it earlier, which I'd love to have done. The last couple of years I've been sort of concentrating the film industry just so we could, we set up a new life here in Margaret River, and I've got a son to help this. And getting it published is complicated now. So little budgets, less budget now than it was 20 years ago. There's more opportunity to get things published, but less opportunity perhaps to earn a living doing it.
Yeah.
And even in this country, once you publish something once, that's pretty much it. Everybody pretty much expects exclusivity.
Right. Okay.
And there are no budgets. You're not going to. You'd be lucky to recover your expenses. I'm not good at playing that game. I mean, I use Facebook because a lot of my friends are interesting people, and their posts are usually worth reading. They're pretty credible sources, in fact. So I tend to, all I do on Facebook is sometimes I have private messages with friends. I keep in touch that way. It's quick, and you have history to conversation, which I like. You find a story you're interested in, I look at it as saving. I never really thought of it as sharing. So I'll pop something on there. So you learn a bit about me by what I share, because that's the sort of thing that I'm interested in.
Yes.
But I don't see it as a personal thing, if that makes sense. To me, it's just like a library.
Yeah.
The Instagram thing's a mystery. I don't have a large following, and I don't. I've got a friend of mine who gave me, John Stanway, very well known and regarded National Geographic photographer, on top of that completely. Constantly on 2 iPhones, and he sees them not as followers but as subscribers. So it's like his own publishing empire in a way. But he has 270 or nearly 300,000 followers.
Wow.
So I can see the point of it. He had some wonderful points to make over a coffee when we were talking about this sort of thing. But I'm just not very good at that. I don't have the body of work. I can't do it every day, which you're supposed to do. I'm not going to photograph something in Bangladesh and put that on Instagram of me having a cup of coffee back in Margaret River. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
No.
So I'm not going to, I can't con people to think I'm having a more interesting life than I actually am.
Yeah.
And I think if you're not, and I know that there are algorithms. I've talked about it with others, and they say, sunsets do well, Aqua does well, Big Surf does well. Look, I might make a point. I mean, look, and I can talk about even just having recently been in Bangladesh, where the camps themselves, you've got 1.1 million people, 670-something thousand since August alone, refugees or survivors of what's happening in Myanmar. So the camps are controlled by the military. Very hard to get access, even for NGOs. So I guess the point I'm going to make is they're having trouble working out who are the legitimate or authentic NGOs, because there's so many ad hocs wanting to go in there and do the right thing. So the same thing when you're donating money to somebody, you should do your research about them. Like, I've got my favourites, which is people like, even some of the UN things like UNICEF and Médecins Sans Frontières in particular, Doctors Without Borders. I know giving them money, I don't think they'd be doing something like that for profit. So it's kind of hard when you say, like, are they using the pictures for profit or are they using it to do their job?
Yeah.
And it's always a complicated thing. You've got to do your research into the NGOs in particular to make sure that that money is getting to the right people. And there's always going to be infrastructure and the red tape they have to deal with, which is going to cost money along the way. There's always going to be that kind of thing in some countries. It's always a complicated place to work. Bangladesh is a complicated place to work, but then you've got a country that's one of the poorest nations on the planet standing up to look after 1.1 million, an influx of 1.1 million refugees. While I was there, I was talking to some of the locals, and they're having to deal with inflation, fuel prices doubling, food having to be brought in. There's no local produce because of the number of people I have to feed. So even though there is some animosity, there's still an awful lot of empathy and caring, and a hell of a lot of people on the ground trying to do something. I know that for a fact that most of the NGOs there were not able to do what they needed to do because they didn't have the funds. So if they're using pictures to get money to help that sort of thing, then I'm all for it. I never censor in camera. There's a lot of pictures you won't see, but when I'm there, still providing some sort of historical event. And some of the most horrific things still need to be recorded because it's proof that they actually happened.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Can I just ask then, both of you doing similar sort of work, how does that work with you two?
Lately, since we chose Martine as a base, obviously I'm not doing humanitarian work at the moment. Occasionally I've been back to the UN on short-term missions, but so I'm doing other kind of works, like I've published a couple of books, and then I do aerial photographic work here in WA. So that's been a way that I found where I, limited edition prints, exhibitions, etc. And I really, really enjoy. And I've also worked with Aboriginal elders on a few stories about endangered languages in the goldfields. So that's been also really great for me because the exhibition is touring, etc. So I think my work has shifted a little bit lately anyway. I find that if we can work together, personally, I love it because I think it's great. It's like we bring both of our eyes together, and I think it's a bonus rather than pulling each other apart or anything. So personally, I love it if we can work together, but sometimes we can't work together.
We do a lot of our commercial work we do together.
Yeah.
So we've got a few local clients, not too many. A lot of my work's away as well. I still do movie stills. That's, the beauty of that is I can lock away for 5 or 6 weeks on a film and then have time off to go and do a story after that. But, we've been doing the family thing as well. So, my son stays with us a lot of the time as well. So we kind of, we hang around. So we're both parents in some sense.
Yes, yes.
And we've got a lovely lifestyle here, and I'm playing a bit more guitar, which is good. But I do love photojournalism. It's so hard to make a living out of it, male or female. I think it's just a very complicated, difficult profession. But it is also a way of life, which is kind of why, even when it gets tough, you're still going to put one foot in front of the other and have a go when you can. It's always finances permitting.
That's the thing. I think 10 years ago I was more willing to not take risk, but just to go there. But nowadays I'm thinking maybe a little bit differently. I'm not sure I want to, make all of these financial risks, because I find, like you said, it's hard to be published, and so I'm shifting a little bit my way, the way I work with my photography, I think.
And I think it's good to evolve as well. And I think also when you get older.
Yes.
It is getting harder.
Yes.
I'd like to know more about whether there is really inequality in the industry. Because, if there is, then we can try and change it from inside. It should be fair. I've seen about, was it the Shitty Man's Media List and all these other things. I've sort of, I've had friends that talked about that, and, hopefully things are changing for the better. It's such a complicated world. There's no room for misogynists, or there just isn't, in this day and age. I think we've come a long way in 30 years. When you look back and even you watch a series of Mad Men, and thank God that's no longer here, hopefully. Certainly not in my circles. I'm sure it is in others. I mean, it's an odd thing, but I tend to have very few friends. The friends I have, I trust, and maybe I judge how things are by the way they relate and react and act. So maybe my world's a little bit smaller than it seems, even though I do a lot of travelling.
Yeah.
But I work alongside, I've never seen anybody mistreated or treated as anything less than equal. In the film industry, I know there have been issues there, and I've been standing next to people that have dealt with that. We've had safety officers that have stood up and stood by people. I'm sure at other times there's been things happen which I have no knowledge of. But hopefully all the stuff that's come out in recent years or recent months will set changes. Will set a different mood. And, we need to be equal. It shouldn't be about skin or sex.
No, that's right.
It should be about talent in the end, really.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got what you do, and that's what gets the rewards.
Yeah.
Look, we have our own issues, like, whether we're good enough or whether we deserve to be somewhere. I mean, there's certainly been a lot of put-downs. I've been put in my place many times in this profession. Told you're not worthy, told all sorts of things, and you've got to rise above that and keep going. You've got to trust in yourself in the end.
That is so true. That's very good advice. I like that. That's a good thing to end on, David.
In fact, it's best to, the more people have certain negativity towards you, I'd say that's when you know you're going the right direction.
Or maybe not really bad.
Because then you need to keep pushing ahead. I always think of past experience where you're right, like doors close, but just keep going. If you believe really in what you're doing, I think you just keep doing what you do.
Have grit and determination.
Yeah.
Excellent. Jolly good. Thank you so much, you two.